16,000 people packed into one stadium. A career-defining win. And then, silence. Not the silence of disappointment, the kind that falls when something happens that nobody has a word for yet. This is what actually went down at Indian Wells, and it had nothing to do with prize money. March 8th, Indian Wells, California. Stadium 1, one of the loudest, most electric arenas in professional tennis. Alexandra EALA had just done something remarkable. She dismantled world number 4, COCO GAUFF, broke her repeatedly in the opening set, reeled off 5 consecutive games, took the first set 6-2 and jumped to a 2-0 lead in the second. She was dominant, composed, and looked every bit like a player who belonged on the biggest stage in the world. Then everything changed. GAUFF began struggling, visibly, painfully, with her left arm. She would later describe the sensation as fireworks detonating inside her muscles, the kind of pain that doesn't give you a choice. She had to stop. She walked toward the net, and in that moment, with 16,000 people holding their breath, the match stopped being about tennis. Flags dropped. The noise died. An entire stadium exhaled together. EALA, standing in the middle of the biggest victory of her career, didn't raise her arms, didn't pump her fist. She walked toward GAUFF, not as an opponent, not as a winner, but as someone who genuinely cared about the person standing across the net from her. She followed her as she gathered her things. She listened as GAUFF explained what had happened. There was no performance in it. Just 2 people, in a quiet corner of an enormous stadium, being human. EALA would later say it was still a massive moment, competing at Stadium 1 against one of the best players on the planet. But even her own words couldn't fully cover what her face gave away in those seconds. Now, to understand why this moment cut so deep, you have to rewind the calendar. Earlier in 2025, EALA had already served notice that something was shifting. At the Miami Open, she had taken down world number 2 Iga Swiatek. Then Grand Slam champions Madison Keys and Elena Rybakina fell in succession. She collected over $332,000 in prize money during that run. Not that the money was ever the point. The point was the statement. She belonged here. She'd always belonged here. The rankings were just catching up. At Indian Wells, she pushed even further. Her run to the round of 16 added another $78,000 to her season earnings. But standing at the microphone after her win, she didn't bring up a single dollar. She spoke about the journey, the process. And then, on International Women's Day, she paused, and something shifted in her voice. She thanked the women who built the path before her. She called COCO GAUFF an extraordinary competitor and a role model, and wished her a fast recovery. And then she turned toward the stands, found her mother's eyes, and said the words that broke the stadium open. The applause that followed wasn't polite. It wasn't respectful. It was felt. The broadcast cameras scrambled to capture it. The crowd didn't want it to end. But there's a layer to this story that the cameras almost missed. One that only makes sense once you know the history between these two. It started with a DM on Instagram before the 2025 Italian Open. EALA, bold as ever, reached out to GAUFF and asked if she'd be her doubles partner. It was a big ask. GAUFF said yes. They went on to reach the quarterfinals together, playing through top competition with a chemistry that surprised even people inside their own camps. But the result was never really the story. The story was what formed between them. On those clay courts, 2 young women from different sides of the world, carrying the weight of enormous expectations, finding something real in each other. They practiced together before the Australian Open. They traded messages after wins and losses. They joked on social media in ways that didn't look staged because they weren't. Theirs was the kind of friendship that sport usually doesn't allow. Too much is at stake. Too much is competing. And yet here it was, right out in the open. So when GAUFF told EALA at the net at Indian Wells, "You're playing great," she meant every syllable. And when EALA walked her off the court with a hand on her back, she meant that too. After the stadium had mostly emptied, something else reportedly happened. Quieter, more personal. EALA had a small commemorative item with her, a token she had received weeks earlier tied to her run at the ASB Classic in Auckland. It wasn't a Grand Slam trophy. It wasn't a WTA title, but it had meant something to her, and she placed it in GAUFF's hands. "I want you to have this. Your message before my first WTA quarterfinal. That meant everything to me." GAUFF looked at it, looked at her, and said, "You're going to have so many more of these. You won't even remember this one." They hugged, not the quick, polite hug of two. Competitors exchanging pleasantries. A real one, the kind that lingers, the clip spread within hours. Friendship over rivalry started trending. Fans who had watched the match live described feeling like they had witnessed something rare, a moment in professional sport that refused to be reduced to a scoreline or a stat. Meanwhile, the rankings moved. EALA broke into the top 30 on the WTA live rankings for the first time in her career. The wins over Swiatek, Keys, Rybakina, and now GAUFF were no longer surprises. They were a pattern, a trajectory, evidence of something building. GAUFF returned to competition at the Miami Open, faced Rybakina, and kept moving forward. When asked about EALA, she didn't hesitate. "She's a class act. I'm lucky to call her my friend." And that's the line that says it all. Because this story was never really about prize money. It wasn't about rankings or trophies or viral moments. It was about two athletes, young, watched, pressured, far from home, who chose to show up for each other in a sport that rarely makes space for that. It was about EALA standing on the biggest stage of her career and still finding the instinct to ask, "Are you okay?" Behind every ranking number is a person. Behind every post-match interview is a lifetime of sacrifice. And every once in a while, on a court in front of 16,000 people, that reality breaks through in a way that the scoreboard can't contain. That's what Indian Wells gave us. Not just a result, a reminder.